The church stood at the heart of Tulsa's historic district, its brick walls weathered but unbroken, a place where whispers of prayers had lingered for over a century. Morning sunlight filtered through tall, stained glass windows, painting fractured beams of color across the wooden pews. The air smelled faintly of candle wax and polished oak. Every Sunday this building transformed into a sanctuary of devotion, though on this particular morning it would also become a stage. The congregation trickled in one by one, dressed in their Sunday best. Mothers hushed restless children, elderly couples settled into their favorite spots, and ushers smiled politely as they passed hymnals down the rows. There was comfort in the ritual, in the predictability of worship. To most who entered, the church was an anchor in a chaotic world. At the center of it all was Pastor William Harrow. He stood tall at the pulpit, Bible in hand, his voice already booming in warm greetings. To his flock, he was the embodiment of faith, a man with piercing blue eyes that seemed to look straight through sin, and a smile that could calm even the most troubled hearts. He wore a charcoal suit, crisp and immaculate, his clerical collar gleaming against the dark fabric. His words dripped with conviction, practiced and perfect. But Ruth Carter, seated 3 rows back, saw him differently. She was 62, her hair a silvery crown pulled into a neat bun, her hands clasped around a worn leather Bible. To the casual observer, she was just another faithful member of the parish, quiet, devoted, steady. Yet behind her eyes was a weight few noticed. Every time Pastor Harrow's voice filled the church, Ruth felt the hollowness beneath it, the subtle cracks in his pious performance. As the choir began their opening hymn, Ruth's gaze wandered to the stained glass window above the altar. It depicted the Good Samurai, tan, kneeling to help a wounded man. The morning sun lit the scene so vividly that it almost looked alive. She thought about the collection plate that would soon pass through the pews, about the envelopes stuffed with bills and checks offered in the name of that same compassion. For years, she had given what she could, sometimes too much, because she believed in the good it would do. But lately, her faith had been corroded by doubt. She recalled a moment 2 months earlier when she'd asked Pastor Harrow where the funds for a local widow had gone. His smile had faltered just slightly, his response smooth but strangely evasive. The memory haunted her still, like a discordant note in a hymn. Since then, she had begun to watch him more closely. The way he avoided certain questions, the way his eyes darted when finances were mentioned, the sharp edge beneath his practiced gentleness. Ruth's suspicion was not yet proof, but it was enough to keep her awake at night. She sat there now, heart beating a little faster as she listened to his sermon begin, words about generosity and sacrifice rolling effortlessly from his tongue. Around her, the congregation nodded, murmuring their amens. To them, he was beyond reproach. Ruth lowered her eyes to the hymnal in her lap, her knuckles tightening. She did not yet know how deep the rot went, only that something was terribly wrong. And in that moment, beneath the colored glow of the stained glass, she made a quiet vow. She would find out the truth, even if no one else believed her. The choir's voices rose, the pastor's hands lifted in blessing, and the faithful bowed their heads. Yet Ruth's eyes remained fixed on Harrow, sharp and unblinking. The morning felt sacred, but to her, it also felt like the beginning of a reckoning. The sermon ended with a thunder of applause and murmurs of approval. Pastor Harrow descended the pulpit steps, shaking hands with parishioners who reached for him as though his touch carried blessing. His laugh echoed warmly through the sanctuary, filling the corners where sunlight faded. To most, it was a sound of reassurance, but to Ruth Carter, it was a performance, polished, hollow, and rehearsed. She lingered in her pew as others filed toward the exit. She didn't want to be swept up in polite small talk or forced smiles. Instead, she listened. It was a habit she had developed in recent months, staying just long enough to catch what others overlooked. Near the aisle, 2 ushers carried the heavy collection plates toward the church office. Ruth's eyes followed them with quiet intensity. She knew the routine. The envelopes would be stacked, counted, and then recorded in the ledgers Pastor Harrow guarded with near obsession. Ruth had asked once, long ago, if members could review the financial reports. The suggestion was dismissed with an indulgent smile. "We must trust God's shepherds," Harrow had said. "Faith is stronger than numbers." Now, Ruth found herself doubting whether those shepherds were leading anyone but themselves. As the sanctuary thinned, her friend Margaret slid into the pew beside her. Margaret was a stout woman with kind eyes and a perpetual frown that deepened whenever gossip stirred. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Ruth, you've been quiet these past weeks. Something's troubling you." Ruth kept her gaze on the stained glass. "Does it ever strike you odd, Margaret, how much we give? All those collections for widows, the orphans in the next county, the relief funds for fires. And yet, I've never once seen where it goes." Margaret stiffened, clutching her purse. "Careful, Ruth. You know how people talk when doubts spread. Pastor Harrow has won so much good here. You don't want to sound ungrateful." Ruth turned then, her expression grave. "Ungrateful? Or awake?" The words lingered between them, sharp and dangerous. Margaret sighed heavily, as if the weight of Ruth's suspicion were too much to bear. "I have heard whispers, yes. But whispers are dangerous things in a church. Best not to stir trouble unless you have proof." Ruth nodded slowly, but her heart gave a painful thud. Proof. That was the word echoing in her mind. Proof was what she lacked, and what she desperately needed. The bell tower struck the hour, its chime reverberating through the hall. Margaret rose, patting Ruth's hand. "Promise me you'll leave this be. Sometimes faith requires us to close our eyes." Ruth forced a faint smile, though inside she burned. "Sometimes faith requires us to open them," she whispered once Margaret was gone. The sanctuary was nearly empty now. A few children darted between pews, their laughter bouncing off the high ceilings. Ruth gathered her Bible and stood, her steps slow and deliberate as she made her way toward the exit. But she paused when she saw the ushers again, this time disappearing into the office with the locked metal box that held the morning's offerings. One of them glanced over his shoulder nervously, as if worried someone might be watching. Ruth's chest tightened. She was watching, and she would keep watching. Outside, the late morning sun blazed over Tulsa's streets. Families walked home arm in arm, their spirits lifted by the sermon's promises. Ruth walked alone, her thoughts heavy. She could almost hear Harrow's voice behind her, smooth and commanding, urging her to trust. But trust without truth, she realized, was just blindness. By the time she reached her small house on the edge of town, her resolve had hardened. She would not let the whispers remain whispers. She would find the evidence hidden behind the pulpit, the ledgers and receipts that revealed where the money truly went. And when she found it, she would make sure no one could deny it. For now, though, she kept her silence. Secrets, after all, grow louder in the quiet. Pastor William Harrow's study was the only room in the church where the air felt heavy. The sanctuary rang with music and prayer, but here silence pressed against the walls. The blinds were always drawn, the shelves lined with theological tomes and framed certificates that testified to his authority. At the center sat a wide oak desk, polished until it gleamed, and in the top drawer, always locked, lay the true heart of his empire. By evening, the church grounds were still, emptied of their congregation. Harrow sat alone in his study, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbow. The public face had slipped away, no warm smile, no fatherly tone, just the sharp, calculating eyes of a man protecting what was his. He flipped through the ledger, each neat line of ink representing another offering, another sacrifice placed in his hands. Beside it sat receipts, not for the orphanage roof or the widow's rent, but for tailored suits from Dallas, a wristwatch imported from Switzerland, and weekend retreats billed as spiritual conferences. He tapped a pen against the desk, the rhythm precise. Numbers never lied, but numbers could be buried. There was a knock at the door. Harrow's voice instantly softened, slipping into the familiar cadence. "Come in." It was Deacon Michael, a young man barely past 30, shoulders stooped under the weight of duty. His eyes darted to the ledger before quickly looking away. "Pastor, the ushers finished counting today's collection, nearly double last week." "God is good," Harrow replied smoothly, sliding the ledger closed. "Leave it on the desk. I'll record it later." Michael hesitated, the metal box still in his hands. "Pastor, may I ask, do the people ever see the reports? Some have wondered." Harrow's smile widened, though it did not reach his eyes. He rose, crossing the room with practiced grace, and placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "Faith is not built on numbers, Michael. It is built on trust. The flock must not be burdened with doubt. Leave such matters to me. Michael swallowed, nodded, and set the box down. But as he left, Harrow's gaze lingered on him, sharp and suspicious. Too many questions, he thought. Questions spread like fire, if not contained. When the door clicked shut, Harrow opened the ledger again. His fingers hovered over the entries, then closed it firmly. Doubt was dangerous, but control was stronger. As long as he held the books, he held the truth. Across town, Ruth Carter sat at her kitchen table, the faint glow of a lamp illuminating her weathered face. She thought of Harrow's sermon, his commanding voice, the eager faces that drank in every word. She thought of Margaret's warning, of whispers left to die in silence, and she thought of the moment she had seen the ushers glance nervously toward the office door. Her hands rested on her Bible, but her mind was not on scripture. It was on the locked drawers in Harrow's study, the papers he guarded as though they were more sacred than the word he preached. A storm was gathering, though neither of them could yet see its shape. Harrow believed himself untouchable, cloaked in holiness and authority. Ruth, however, believed in something else. That truth, no matter how hidden, had a way of breaking through stained glass. For now, their paths remained separate. His steeped in secrecy, hers in suspicion. But they were moving inexorably toward collision, and when it came, the church would never be the same. The church stood hushed beneath the velvet shroud of night, its towering steeple cut against the moonlit sky, casting a long shadow across the silent street. The building that welcomed hundreds each Sunday now seemed foreboding, its stained glass windows dark and lifeless without the sun. Ruth Carter lingered in that shadow, her heart hammering against her ribs, palms damp despite the cool air. She had never broken into anything in her 62 years, but tonight was different. Tonight, silence and doubt had become unbearable companions. She needed answers. Not whispered suspicions, not vague unease. Proof. The kind that could not be explained away by Harrow's smooth voice or dismissed by Margaret's trembling warnings. Her fingers shook as she slid the spare key from her pocket. Years of volunteering in the church kitchen had given her trust, and with trust had come access. She whispered a prayer, not for forgiveness, but for courage, and pushed the heavy door open. The sanctuary smelled different at night. Gone was the mingling perfume of candles and pressed suits. In its place was the musk of wood and dust, as though the building itself exhaled when no one was watching. Ruth's shoes clicked softly against the tile as she moved past the empty pews, her eyes flicking nervously toward the altar. The study was her destination, the room behind the pulpit where Harrow locked away his secrets. She had imagined it so many times that stepping inside felt strangely familiar. The air was stale, the blinds pulled tight, the desk looming like an altar to power. Her breath caught as she turned the knob, surprised to find it unlocked. Inside, moonlight slipped through a gap in the curtains, faintly illuminating the shelves. Books lined the walls, their spines gleaming. On the desk sat a neat stack of envelopes, each marked with donation amounts. Ruth's pulse quickened. She pulled a pair of gloves from her coat pocket, an instinct born not of experience but of caution, and began her search. The top drawer rattled when she tugged at it, locked. Of course. She tried the others, pens, papers, stationery, mundane, but her eyes caught a glimmer of brass on the shelf above. A small key lay between two thick commentaries on scripture. Harrow, it seemed, had grown careless. Her fingers trembled as she slid the key into the drawer. It turned with a click that echoed like thunder in the stillness. Inside, the truth waited. Receipts, neatly folded, each bearing dates and amounts. At first, they seemed ordinary: catering, supply orders, church utilities. But as she unfolded more, her stomach dropped. There were charges for a luxury hotel in Dallas, for jewelry, for wine that cost more than Ruth made in a month. A receipt from a dealership caught her breath. A down payment on a sleek black car she had seen Harrow driving only once, dismissing it as a loaner from a friend. Her throat tightened. These were not mistakes. This was theft, dressed in scripture. She spread the papers across the desk, the moonlight catching the ink. Her hands clenched into fists. All those widows who went without heating oil in winter, the families who scraped together coins to fill the collection plate. Their sacrifices had been feeding Harrow's indulgence. A noise startled her, the creak of wood, a faint rustle in the hall. She froze, pulse hammering, eyes darting to the door. For a moment, she thought she saw a shadow slip across the crack at the bottom, but then it was gone, leaving only silence. Ruth gathered the receipts, her breath shallow. She could not take them all. It would be too obvious. Instead, she folded 3 and tucked them into her Bible, the one place Harrow would never dare search. The rest she returned carefully, locking the drawer again. Her hands shook as she closed the office door behind her. The sanctuary loomed larger now, darker, as if watching her trespass. She walked swiftly down the aisle, her heels clicking like gunshots against the floor. Outside, the night air hit her like a baptism, cold and bracing. She clutched her Bible tightly to her chest, aware that inside its pages now rested both faith and evidence. For the first time, Ruth felt the weight of what she carried. It was more than paper. It was the beginning of war. Sunday morning came again, but Ruth Carter walked into the church with a different kind of weight pressing on her chest. The Bible tucked under her arm felt heavier than usual. Inside its worn pages, she carried not only scripture but evidence, receipts folded carefully between psalms, damning proof that could not be explained away. She tried to still her trembling hands as she slid into her usual pew. Around her, the congregation hummed with familiar energy, greetings exchanged, children tugging at sleeves, the choir warming their voices. Nothing about their joy had changed, yet Ruth saw it all through the lens of what she had uncovered. Every smile seemed built on a lie, every hymn tainted by deceit. Pastor Harrow moved gracefully through the crowd, his booming laugh and confident handshake drawing people in. He paused to bless a child, to pray with an elderly woman, his presence magnetic. Only Ruth seemed immune to his charm. Her jaw tightened as she watched him. She thought of the receipts tucked inside her Bible, the car, the hotel, the jewelry, all bought with their devotion. When the service ended, Ruth did not linger in the pews. She waited in the shadows of the parking lot, her breath forming small clouds in the cool air. Cars pulled away one by one, gravel crunching under tires. She stayed until only a handful of vehicles remained. That was when she saw him, Deacon Michael carrying a stack of hymnals toward his car. His shoulders were slumped, his face weary, though he was young enough to be her son. Ruth stepped forward, her heart thudding. "Michael," she called softly. He turned, startled. "Mrs. Carter, you nearly gave me a fright. I need to talk to you," she said, lowering her voice. "Somewhere private." He hesitated, looking around as if the shadows themselves might be listening. Then he nodded and set the books in his trunk. "All right, speak quick." Cly. Ruth opened her Bible, slipping the folded papers into his hand. His brows furrowed as he unfolded them. The dim light of the parking lot caught the ink, his eyes scanning the receipts. A silence stretched between them before he finally looked up, his face pale. "My God," he whispered. "Where did you find these?" "In his office," Ruth replied, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "Locked away like secrets in a coffin. I couldn't take them all, but I took enough." Michael rubbed the back of his neck, glancing toward the church doors. "I suspected, but I didn't want to believe it. He's been like a father to me. When my own family turned me out, he took me in, gave me purpose. And now you see the truth," Ruth said sharply. "Purpose built on theft. Faith twisted into profit. Do you understand what this means?" Michael's jaw clenched. "It means if you're right, the entire congregation will turn on him, and on us. People don't want to believe their shepherd is a wolf. They'll call you bitter, call me a traitor. They'll call us whatever they like," Ruth said, her voice rising with conviction. "But truth doesn't care what names it's given. We have to expose him." Michael folded the papers again, his hands shaking. "If we do this, there's no going back. He won't forgive it. He won't let us walk away unscathed." Ruth looked him in the eye, her expression unyielding. "Then we don't walk away. We stand. We speak. We let the whole church hear it, and we don't stop until they see." A gust of wind stirred, scattering leaves across the lot. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Michael tucked the papers into his coat, his shoulders squared with reluctant resolve. "All right," he said quietly. "But if we're going to bring him down, We need more than this. We need to plan. Carefully. Ruth nodded. Though her heart knew caution would only delay the inevitable, the stage was already set, the truth pressing at the seams. As Michael turned to leave, Ruth glanced back at the dark silhouette of the church, its stained glass windows catching no light. For the first time she felt the danger coiled within those walls. The reckoning she had imagined was no longer distant. It was coming, and it would begin where faith was supposed to feel safest. On a Sunday morning, beneath the pulpit's shadow. Ruth Carter sat in her car long after the last hymn had faded from memory, the smell of damp hymnals still clinging to her clothes. She had replayed every glance, every muttered word, every sharp inhale she had witnessed inside the church that morning. The air was thick with a revelation she hadn't fully pieced together, yet. When she finally stepped out, the Oklahoma dusk stretched long shadows over the cracked pavement of the church parking lot. A man stood by the edge of the lot, hands shoved into his pockets, head tilted as if waiting for her. It was Daniel Price, the young accountant who had joined the congregation just a year ago. Ruth knew him only in passing. He had a quiet way about him, always sitting in the back pew with his notebook, scribbling during services. "Mrs. Carter," he said softly, his voice hesitant, like a secret trying to find permission. Ruth froze. "Daniel, you startled me." He glanced around nervously, eyes darting toward the church doors. "I need to tell someone. I don't know who else to trust." Something in his tone made Ruth's stomach clench. She leaned against her car, folding her arms as if bracing herself. "Tell me what?" Daniel's voice dropped, barely above a whisper. "The pastor. Harrow. He's not who you think he is." Ruth narrowed her eyes. "I've suspected that much. But what do you know?" Daniel swallowed hard. The streetlights flickered on, their hum filling the silence. "I work with the books. Or, I used to. The charity fund everyone's been so proud of. The one raising money for widows for the community center." He shook his head. "It's a front. The money's being siphoned. Thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands." The ground seemed to tilt beneath Ruth. She gripped the cold metal of her car door. "Are you sure?" "I saw the transfers myself," Daniel whispered. "Shell accounts, out-of-state wires. It's clean enough to fool most, but not all. I confronted him once, quietly. He told me to pray for clarity. Then the next week, my access to the ledgers was cut off." A chill ran through Ruth's veins. She studied Daniel's pale face, the way his hands trembled. He wasn't inventing this. He was burdened, haunted. "You should go to the police," Ruth said firmly, though even as the words left her lips, she knew how dangerous they sounded in the open air. Daniel gave a short, bitter laugh. "And say what? That a beloved pastor is funneling church money? They'll think I'm slandering him. He has friends in high places. Even the mayor shows up in his pew." The weight of his words pressed down on Ruth. For a moment, neither spoke. The sound of cicadas filled the gap. Finally, Daniel leaned closer, his voice urgent. "But there's more. He's meeting someone outside the church. I don't know who, but I think they're involved, if we can prove it. If we can catch him in the act." Ruth's breath caught. A storm was brewing, and she was standing at its edge. Her suspicions had just been confirmed, but the reality was darker than she had imagined. She placed a hand on Daniel's arm, steadying him as much as herself. "Then we'll have to watch him. Together." Daniel's eyes widened, relief flickering through his fear. "You'd help me?" Ruth nodded slowly, her voice low and resolute. "I've followed this man for decades, trusted him with my prayers. If he's betrayed us all, then it's time someone holds him accountable." The church bell tolled softly, in the distance, marking the hour. Both of them stood in silence, as if the sound sealed their uneasy alliance. But as Ruth looked back toward the looming cross atop the church roof, a shadow passed across her heart. Exposing William Harrow would not be simple. In a place where faith masked fear and reverence cloaked corruption, truth would not just set them free, it could get them killed. And she knew, with bone-deep certainty, that the walls of Harrow's church were hiding far more than stolen dollars. Ruth Carter barely slept. The whispered confession from Daniel replayed in her head like a hymn gone wrong, one that left her restless, dissonant, and unable to escape its melody. The morning light creeping through her blinds felt thin and brittle, a poor shield against the weight of what she now knew. She arrived at the church earlier than usual, slipping quietly into the sanctuary. The pews sat empty, the air cool, heavy with incense from the previous service. She ran her fingertips across the polished wood, as if the benches themselves might confess what they had witnessed. At the pulpit stood Pastor Harrow, alone, his back to her. He was rehearsing, murmuring words under his breath, hands gesturing with the practiced ease of a man born to command attention. The sight churned something inside Ruth. He looked every bit the shepherd his flock adored, yet she now knew his crook was carved from deceit. "Pastor," she called softly. He turned, startled for only a fraction of a second before masking it with his usual smile. "Sister Ruth," he said warmly, spreading his arms. "Up early, as always. The faithful rise before the sun." Her lips pressed tight. "Some truths rise with it too." He chuckled, stepping down from the pulpit. "What weighs on your heart today?" The words nearly spilled from her mouth, but she bit them back. Instead, she studied him, the way his eyes never fully met hers, the subtle twitch of his jaw when silence stretched too long. She remembered Daniel's warning, he has friends in high places. If she pushed too soon, she could lose everything. "I just wanted to pray," Ruth said finally, her voice thin. Harrow nodded. "Then pray we all stay on the righteous path." As he walked past her, Ruth caught a faint smell of cologne mixed with cigar smoke. Her heart skipped. Harrow despised cigars. He had lectured men before for smoking outside the church. That detail, small but sharp, pricked her suspicions deeper. Later that day, Ruth met Daniel in the corner booth of a quiet diner. The clatter of dishes and low hum of conversation offered cover for words they dared not speak in daylight. "He was practicing at the pulpit when I came in," Ruth said, stirring her untouched coffee. "And there was something else. Smoke. Cigar smoke on him." Daniel's face tightened. He pulled a crumpled folder from his satchel and slid it across the table. "I've been tracking his withdrawals. Look here. Last Friday, a cash transfer. The same night he left early from the fellowship meeting. I saw him drive off with a man I didn't recognize." Ruth opened the folder. Numbers and dates filled the page, cold evidence staring back at her. "Do you know who the man was?" Daniel shook his head. "Tall, heavy-set, wearing a dark suit. Didn't look like a parishioner. More like someone you wouldn't want to cross." Ruth's pulse quickened. Harrow wasn't acting alone. He was tethered to someone, or something, bigger. "Then we'll need to watch more closely," she whispered, glancing around to ensure no one was listening. Daniel leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. "There's a board meeting this Thursday. Closed doors. No one but the deacons are allowed inside. But if we can get close enough—" He trailed off, letting the implication settle. Ruth nodded. "We'll hear what he's hiding, one way or another." For a moment, silence hung between them, heavy as stone. Outside the diner window, Tulsa's streets moved on with ordinary life. Children riding bikes, neighbors exchanging greetings. None of them knew that a fracture had begun inside the church that claimed to guide their souls. As Ruth folded the folder shut, she felt the weight of it in her hands, as if it contained not paper but prophecy. Exposing Harrow meant pulling a thread, one that could unravel more than his reputation. It could unravel lives. And somewhere in the shadows, she sensed Harrow already knew someone was watching. Thursday evening fell heavy on Tulsa. The sky bruised purple as storm clouds gathered in the distance. Ruth Carter sat in her car across from the church, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles burned. Every nerve screamed at her to drive away, to forget Daniel's whispers, the folder of numbers, the smell of cigar smoke. But her faith in Harrow had already cracked, and she could not turn back now. Daniel appeared at her window, tapping softly. His face was drawn, pale under the flickering streetlight. "They're inside," he said. "Board's already gathering." Ruth nodded, stepping out. Together they moved along the side of the church, the building looming above them like a fortress. The stained glass windows glowed faintly from within, painting streaks of holy light onto the damp grass. But tonight, those colors felt tainted, like masks hiding corruption. They slipped in through a side door Ruth knew well, one the choir used on Sunday mornings. Inside, the corridors were dim, the sound of muffled voices drifting from the fellowship hall. The board meeting had begun. "Careful," Daniel whispered. "We can't let them see us." Ruth led him to a narrow hallway behind the hall, where a sliver of light cut through the cracked doorframe. The air smelled of coffee and old hymnals, but beneath it lingered something sharper: tension, secrecy. Through the crack, Ruth could see them. Pastor Harrow at the head of the table, 6 deacons seated in a semicircle. Papers were spread across the polished wood. The men spoke in low, measured tones, their words just audible enough for Ruth and Daniel to catch fragments. "The transfers went through?" one deacon asked. Harrow nodded. "Discretion is everything. The congregation believes their donations are changing lives, and in a way, they are, just not in the way they imagine." His lips curled into a smile. Ruth's stomach turned. She gripped Daniel's arm, as if grounding herself against the weight of the revelation. Another deacon leaned forward. "But what about Price?" Daniel stiffened at his name. Harrow's voice hardened. "He's been silenced. His access is gone. If he speaks out, it's his word against the church. And no one in Tulsa will take the side of a bitter accountant over the Lord's servant." Ruth could feel Daniel's breath quicken beside her. His face was pale as ash. "But William," one older deacon said cautiously, "what if others start asking questions? What if Carter keeps sniffing around? She's been loyal, yes, but she's also persistent." The room fell into silence. Ruth's heart stopped. Her name on Harrow's lips. Then slowly the pastor spoke. "Ruth Carter is faithful, but faith can be molded. If she doubts, we remind her who holds the power of forgiveness. And if that fails—" He paused, his tone chilling. "There are other ways to ensure obedience." Ruth clamped a hand over her mouth, fighting the urge to gasp. The man she had trusted for decades now spoke of her as if she were a threat to be managed, a problem to be erased. Daniel touched her shoulder, his eyes wide, urging her to move. But Ruth couldn't. She felt rooted to the spot, torn between fury and fear. Harrow's voice softened, almost tender. "Brothers, this church is more than a house of God. It is a shield, a weapon, a throne, and none of us can afford cracks in its foundation." The men murmured their agreement. The meeting pressed on, details spilling like poison into the room, more transfers, out-of-state connections, promises of favors owed. Finally, Harrow rose, gathering the papers. "This concludes tonight's business. Let us pray." Ruth and Daniel slipped away before the deacons bowed their heads, moving quickly through the hall's shadowed corridors until they reached the cold air outside. Both leaned against the brick wall, breathing hard, as if they had just escaped a burning building. Daniel's voice shook. "They know your name. He's watching you." Ruth stared back at the glowing stained glass, her hands trembling. "Then it's already begun," she whispered. And in the pit of her stomach she knew, exposing Harrow wasn't just about stolen money anymore. It was survival. Sunday came heavy with clouds, the air damp with the promise of rain. Ruth Carter walked into the sanctuary with a smile painted on her face, though every nerve inside her screamed. After the board meeting, she had slept little, haunted by Harrow's words, her name spoken like a curse, a warning. The congregation filled the pews as if nothing had shifted. Children tugged on their mothers' skirts, ushers passed out bulletins, and the choir hummed softly. But Ruth's eyes were fixed on the pulpit. Pastor Harrow stood tall, his robe falling in clean lines, his smile serene. Only Ruth and Daniel knew the rot festering beneath the polished surface. When the sermon began, Harrow's words struck her differently now. They carried weight, not of holiness, but of control. "We must beware the spirit of betrayal," he declared, his voice smooth as silk. "The enemy works through those closest to us, those who doubt, who whisper, who question what God has ordained." Ruth's stomach tightened. Around her, The congregation nodded in solemn agreement. They weren't hearing a threat. They were hearing scripture. She dared a glance toward Daniel in the back pew. His jaw was clenched, his eyes narrowed. He too had heard the venom beneath the velvet. After service, as Ruth gathered her purse, a shadow fell across her. Harrow stood there, his smile wide, his hand reaching gently for hers. "Sister Ruth," he said warmly, though his grip on her hand was firm, unyielding. "You've seemed troubled of late. I hope you're not allowing doubt to take root." Ruth forced a smile, though her pulse thundered. "Just weary, Pastor. The world presses heavy at times." His eyes lingered on hers, sharp, probing. "We must remember, doubt is the seed of betrayal. And betrayal, it destroys not only the betrayer, but all who surround them." The words chilled her. This was no casual admonition. It was a warning. "Perhaps you should join me for prayer this week," Harrow continued, his tone lightening, though his grip never loosened. "Private prayer. We'll ask the Lord to steady your heart." Ruth nodded faintly, her throat dry. Only when he released her did she realize how tightly he had been holding on. That night, Ruth and Daniel met again in her modest kitchen, the single overhead bulb casting a yellow glow over the table between them. She recounted every word, every squeeze of Harrow's hand, every glance that felt like a blade pressed against her skin. "He knows," Daniel muttered, pacing the linoleum floor. "He's testing you, seeing how much you'll bend before you break." Ruth's hands trembled as she clutched her teacup. "He invited me to pray with him privately." Daniel stopped pacing. "That's not prayer. That's control. He's isolating you." For a moment, silence hung between them. Rain began tapping against the window, steady, relentless. "We can't keep waiting," Daniel said finally, his voice firm. "The longer we do, the more dangerous this becomes. We need proof, something undeniable, something even his allies can't ignore." Ruth lifted her eyes to his, weary but resolute. "And if he already suspects me, if he's watching my every move, then we make him slip," Daniel said. "We use his arrogance against him. Men like Harrow, they think they're untouchable. That's when they make mistakes." Ruth drew a shaky breath. His words steadied her. She had been living in Harrow's shadow for too long, blinded by faith, by loyalty. Now, for the first time, she felt the fire of defiance burning brighter than her fear. Outside, thunder rolled across the city, shaking the window panes. It sounded less like a storm and more like a warning. The confrontation was no longer distant. It was coming fast, and it would not end without blood. The church was empty that evening, the soft hum of fluorescent lights mingling with the distant wail of a siren outside. Ruth Carter and Daniel Price crept along the side corridors, careful not to disturb the hush of the building that had once felt sacred. Tonight, it was their battlefield. In her hand, Ruth clutched the Bible containing the first receipts she had taken from Harrow's desk. Daniel carried a folder full of additional evidence he had painstakingly gathered over the past week. Bank statements, invoices, even photographs of Harrow meeting men in dark parking lots. Each piece of paper was a thread in the web of deception they were about to unravel. "Are you sure about this?" Daniel whispered, his voice taut with tension. Ruth's eyes glimmered with a mixture of fear and determination. "He thinks he's untouchable. Tonight, we prove he isn't." They slipped into the church office. Harrow's desk sat under the lamp's dim glow, the polished wood gleaming. Ruth knelt, opening the top drawer she had unlocked weeks ago, and began arranging the receipts and documents, leaving just enough to make the discovery look accidental. Daniel stood guard near the door, every muscle coiled like a spring. They had planned meticulously. Leave the evidence in a place Harrow could not resist. Wait for him to handle it and observe. If they were careful, no one would suspect. The first step of their trap was simple, yet dangerous, because Harrow's instinct for control was legendary. A noise made them freeze, the faint shuffle of shoes, almost imperceptible. Harrow. He appeared in the doorway, robe flowing, eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "Ruth? Daniel? What are you doing here at this hour?" His voice was calm, almost paternal, but there was an undercurrent of steel. Ruth stepped forward, holding the Bible. "Pastor, we need to talk. It's about the donations, the money, the people you're supposed to protect." Harrow's eyes darkened, but the smile never left his face. "Is that so? You mean the funds I've guided, safeguarded, and allocated with the utmost care?" Daniel swallowed hard, but Ruth pressed on. "We know where the money is going. The shell accounts, the purchases, the lies. It ends tonight." For a heartbeat, Harrow said nothing. Then, slowly, deliberately, he closed the office door behind him. "You think you have proof?" he said softly, voice edged with threat. "But proof is a matter of perspective and perception." He gestured to the scattered documents. "Can be manipulated. Are you certain the congregation will believe you?" Ruth felt the cold press of fear. Every nerve screamed to run, but she held her ground. "We have more than perception. We have receipts, statements, photos. You can't spin this." Harrow leaned back against the desk, his smile returning, but it was sharper now, predatory. "And yet, here you stand, trembling in my office. I wonder who truly has the upper hand." Daniel's hand brushed Ruth's arm, a silent reminder. Courage was contagious. Ruth took a steadying breath, stepping closer. "The upper hand is with truth, Pastor, and the truth has been waiting for this moment." Harrow's eyes flickered, ever so briefly, a shadow of unease crow. Seeing his otherwise impenetrable facade, he had underestimated their persistence. The trap had been set, the evidence lay before him, and in the tension-filled silence, the air seemed to quiver with inevitability. Tonight would not end in words alone. Somewhere deep inside, Ruth sensed it. Harrow would make his move, and when he did, everything they had prepared, everything they had uncovered, would collide in a way that could not be undone. Outside, Tulsa slept, oblivious to the storm gathering behind the walls of a church that had long claimed to shelter faith, yet now teetered on the edge of ruin. Sunday arrived with a heavy gray sky, rain streaking the stained glass windows of the Tulsa church. The congregation gathered as usual, unaware of the storm already brewing inside the walls. Ruth Carter and Daniel Price took their seats near the back, their hearts pounding in unison. The evidence they had set in motion the night before was ready to speak for itself, but so was Harrow. Pastor William Harrow emerged from the sacristy, robe flowing, smile immaculate, eyes scanning his flock as though nothing had changed. Every step was deliberate, each gesture rehearsed to perfection. To the congregation, he was still their shepherd. To Ruth and Daniel, he was a predator cornered, his teeth just beginning to show. The sermon began with familiar cadence. Words like honey dripped from his lips. "Faith is tested not in calm, but in the storm, and the storm will come for each of us." Ruth gripped her Bible tightly, aware that inside it lay the receipts that could destroy him. Daniel's hand hovered over his folder. Both of them waited, tense, calculating the exact moment to intervene. Harrow's voice grew louder, more passionate. "Yet some in this house, those who doubt, those who question, would seek to undermine the Lord's work. They would expose the faithful to shame, not knowing the cost of their meddling." He paused, scanning the congregation. His eyes lingered on Ruth, sharp as daggers hidden behind velvet. "And those who betray will face the consequences, not just spiritually, but personally." Ruth's stomach tightened. He was aware. He knew someone was onto him. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air thick as if it pressed against her chest. When Harrow moved toward the pulpit, Daniel whispered urgently, "Now, Ruth." While he's distracted, Ruth rose, moving toward the front, heart hammering. She opened her Bible and let the folded receipts spill onto the pulpit. Gasps erupted immediately. Some members stepped back, eyes wide in disbelief. Harrow froze, his hand gripping the lectern. His lips twitched, but no words came. He had never anticipated open defiance, not from Ruth Carter, not in front of the entire congregation. Daniel stepped forward, opening his folder, revealing photographs of Harrow with men in dark suits, envelopes exchanged, hands shaking over stacks of cash. The murmurs became whispers, then murmurs turned into panic. Harrow's calm shattered. "Stop! This is blasphemy!" he barked, voice rising, tremor betraying his composure. "Blasphemy is what you've been committing," Ruth said, voice strong, echoing through the hall. stealing from the faithful, hiding lies behind sermons, profiting off devotion. The pastor's eyes darted, calculating, searching for escape. He took a step back, knocking over the pulpit candle. Flames leapt, catching the edge of the hymnals. Panic erupted in the congregation as smoke began curling toward the ceiling. Harrow's next move was sudden and violent. He lunged toward the lectern, trying to snatch the evidence from Ruth's hands. In the struggle, a candle tipped onto the floor. A small explosion of fire and smoke filled the room, obscuring everything. Screams cut through the chaos. Ruth stumbled backward, Daniel shielding her. Harrow's form moved frantically, knocking over a chair, the fire spreading. In the confusion, he tripped over the pulpit's base, falling against the sharp edge of the lectern. A sickening crack echoed through the hall as he collapsed, blood pooling on the polished wood. Silence followed. Congregants stared, frozen. Ruth and Daniel moved cautiously through the smoke, hearts racing, the reality sinking in. Pastor Harrow was dead. Ruth fell to her knees, shaking, the receipts scattered around her. The weight of years of faith and betrayal pressed down. They had exposed the truth, but the cost had been staggering. The man who had once commanded devotion now lay silent, his secrets finally revealed in the most brutal way. Outside, the storm broke fully, rain pelting the church as if washing the sins from its walls. Ruth rose slowly, looking at Daniel. They knew there would be questions, investigations, and whispers for years to come, but the truth had finally shattered the facade. The congregation emerged from the pews, eyes wide, murmuring, some weeping. Justice had come in an unexpected form, messy, sudden, and irrevocable. And for Ruth and Daniel, it was only the beginning. For in the shadows of Tulsa, behind every saintly face, lay secrets waiting to be uncovered, waiting for the next storm.